Have you ever, given someone a really strong warning, maybe based on your own past mistakes, and then just had to watch things go sideways because they didn't listen?
Oh, yeah. It happens all the time, doesn't it? Big things, small things. Like ignoring weather warnings or that friend saying, don't do it.
Exactly. Well, today on the deep dive, we're looking at a pretty epic example of that. One of you sent us an audio source. It's a session from something called the Stormy Voyage Bible Conference.
Right. And it focuses specifically on a passage in the Bible, Acts chapter 27, verses 9 through 20. It describes this really dramatic sea voyage.
So we're going to unpack the speaker's take on this story. What's interesting is how they use this ancient voyage as, well, a kind of lens for understanding things they believe are happening right now.
Mm-hmm. And for you listening, it's a chance to see one specific way someone interprets a text and applies it. Our mission isn't to, agree or disagree with the interpretation itself.
No, not at all. It's more about understanding the connections the speaker makes, the logic behind it, and maybe seeing what it tells us about how people navigate information or even their own spiritual journeys. Avoiding shipwrecks, you could say.
Metaphorically speaking, yeah. So let's dive in.
Okay, first, setting the scene. The speaker in the session really emphasizes the when. We're talking late September, early October. Why is that important?
Well, the speaker points out this is after the Day of Atonement. And historically, that marked the start of the really dangerous sailing season in the Mediterranean. Think autumn storms, rough seas.
Not a great time for a boat trip. And where were they?
They were at a place called Fair Havens on the island of Crete. And they had this dilemma.
Okay.
Do they stay put for the winter in Fair Havens, which apparently wasn't a great harbor, kind of exposed, uncomfortable, or risk sailing, just about 40 miles up the coast?
Just 40 miles? To where?
To a harbor called Phoenix, or Phoenix, supposedly much better sheltered, much more suitable for wintering.
Ah. Okay, so stay in a bad spot or risk a short but potentially dangerous trip to a better spot.
Precisely. And that's where Paul steps in. The speaker reminds us, Paul wasn't exactly new to sea travel. He'd already survived 3 shipwrecks by this point.
3? Wow, so he knew the risks.
You'd think so. He strongly advised against sailing to Phoenix. His warning was pretty blunt, actually. He predicted hurt and much damage.
Hurt and much damage.
Yeah, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. So he's saying cargo, ship, people all at risk. Serious stuff.
Definitely high stakes. But they didn't listen, did they?
Nope. The decision wasn't Paul's to make. It fell to the Roman centurion, Julius, who was in charge of this ship. It was a government grain ship.
Oh, yeah.
And Julius listened to the ship's captain and the owner. They wanted to go to Phoenix, better harbor, more comfortable winter. So he sided with them.
Overruling the guy who'd actually survived 3 shipwrecks.
Yeah. They weighed the risk, maybe thought it was just a short hop, and decided to go for it. Comfort over caution, essentially.
So they set sail. And this is where our audio source, the speaker, really takes this historical event and runs with it, isn't it? They see it as more than just a story.
Exactly. This is the core of their interpretation. They see this whole voyage as an analogy, a kind of picture for what they call the current dispensation of grace.
Dispensation of grace. Can you unpack that term a bit?
Sure. In their theological view, it's basically the current era, the period we're living in now, characterized by God's grace offered through Christ. And the speaker sees the events on that ship as symbolizing the church's journey through this era.
Okay, so it's a big analogy. Let's break down the pieces. What represents what?
Right. So in this interpretation, the ship itself, that's the church.
Okay, the church. Makes sense.
The wind, especially the storm wind later, that symbolizes spiritual opposition. The speaker explicitly mentions satanic influence.
Right. And the waves?
The waves are seen as the nations of the world kind of stirred up by that opposition.
Okay, ship is church, wind is opposition, waves are nations. And the journey itself from Fair Havens towards Rome.
That represents the church's journey through this whole dispensation of grace.
Got it. So where does Paul's warning fit in? His advice not to sail?
Ah, that's key. Paul's counsel is equated with the direct instructions from Christ for the church today. And crucially, the speaker believes these instructions are found primarily, almost exclusively, in Paul's letters in the New Testament.
So a real emphasis on Paul's writings as the guide for today.
A very strong emphasis, yes.
And the people who ignored Paul, the centurion, the captain, the owner, who are they in this analogy?
According to the speaker, they represent leaders within the church today. Maybe influential teachers, denominational heads, people who Well, people who the speaker feels prioritize other voices.
Other voices, like tradition or maybe other parts of the Bible.
Exactly. Tradition, human reasoning, denominational stances, even teachings from other biblical figures, if they seem to conflict with Paul. The speaker argues that listening to these other voices instead of sticking strictly to Paul has led to serious spiritual consequences for the church.
Consequences for not sticking to what they call Paul's grace truth. Okay. I think the audio then gets into specific examples of how the speaker thinks Paul's teachings are being rejected, right?
It does, yeah. It moves from the general analogy to specific points of doctrine.
What kind of examples do they give?
Well, the first one is pretty fundamental. Just believing other things more than Paul's specific teachings, giving more weight to other perspectives, maybe even actively speaking against Paul's message.
Do they cite examples of that happening?
They do. They reference Acts 13, where Paul faced opposition, and also a verse in 2 Timothy where Paul sounds quite discouraged, saying everyone in Asia had turned away from him.
Okay. But it goes beyond just general disagreement, doesn't it? There are specific doctrines involved.
Oh, absolutely. A major point for the speaker is anything that adds requirements to salvation beyond pure faith in Christ.
Like what?
Things like saying water baptism is necessary for salvation, or that you have to promise to turn from all your sins to be saved initially, or needing to confess sins to stay saved, or making Christ Lord of your life as a condition of salvation itself.
So anything seen as adding works or conditions to grace.
Pretty much. The speaker sees these as undermining the faith alone principle they believe Paul taught.
And they tackle some big theological debates too, I remember, like eternal security.
Yes, once saved, always saved. The speaker argues strongly for it, attributing it clearly to Paul, and suggests that rejecting it. Well, they claim it sometimes comes from a desire for control in religious systems.
Control how so?
Maybe keeping people dependent, or even, they suggest, for financial reasons. It's a strong claim.
It is. What else?
They talk about the one baptism mentioned by Paul, interpreting it as the spiritual union with Christ at salvation, not water baptism. They also strongly defend the pre-tribulation rapture view.
The idea that the church is removed before a final tribulation period?
Correct. They see that as a specific truth revealed to Paul and argue that denying or attacking it is another way of rejecting his unique message.
It's quite a list. Mixing law and grace, applying Israel's promises to the church, trying to use miraculous gifts they think have ceased.
Exactly. It paints a picture from the speaker's viewpoint of a church that has, in many ways, ignored its navigational chart, Paul's letters, and is consequently off course.
Leading to, well, in the story, ignoring Paul led directly to the storm and the near shipwreck. So in the analogy, what are the consequences of the church ignoring Paul's teachings?
One big one is following the crowd, the more part, as the text says, doing what's popular or traditional rather than sticking to what the speaker sees as Paul's harder truths.
They connect that to other scriptures too, right?
Yeah, they bring in Jesus's words about the narrow way versus the broad way, and also Paul's own warnings in Timothy about people departing from the faith and turning to myths in the last days.
And the ultimate consequence in this framework.
Spiritual shipwreck, a term Paul himself used, basically losing one's doctrinal bearings, getting spiritually damaged by false teachings.
Okay, so back to the ship. They sail against Paul's advice. What happens next with the weather? Because the speaker uses that too.
Right. So first, a gentle south wind starts blowing. Seems perfect.
Like maybe ignoring Paul was okay after all.
Exactly. The speaker interprets this as like a deception. The devil making it seem like the wrong path is actually the right one, a false sense of security.
But it doesn't last.
Not at all. Suddenly, this violent northeasterly wind hits them. It's called Uraden in the text, basically a typhoon force wind.
Wow.
And the key thing is the ship is just caught. It can't sail against it. It's completely driven by the storm, totally out of control.
And in the analogy, this represents
the church losing control, being tossed around by worldly pressures, by doctrinal chaos, because it ignored Paul's guidance. It's at the mercy of the storm, so to speak.
even the near miss with the island of Kla.
Yeah, the speaker sees that as symbolizing maybe narrow escapes the church has had, moments where disaster was barely averted despite being off course.
It's a very detailed, symbolic reading. And they even interpret the actions the sailors took during the storm, don't they?
Yes, every detail seems to have a parallel. For instance, hauling the small lifeboat, the skiff aboard, it was hard work.
What does that represent?
The speaker suggests that this is like the efforts of believers who do follow Paul, trying to help the wider church survive the storm of this age. But the fact they even had the skiff trailing behind is seen as a sign they didn't fully trust Paul's initial warning not to sail at all.
Interesting. What about undergirding the ship, using ropes to hold it together?
That's interpreted as symbolizing things like prayer warriors or ministries working behind the scenes, providing essential support to keep the church structure from completely falling apart in difficult times.
And lowering the sails, striking sail.
The speaker connects that to the church operating out of fear of legalism, maybe fear of losing salvation, instead of living boldly in the freedom of grace that Paul taught.
And they were throwing things overboard too, right? Cargo, tackle.
Yeah, lightening the ship. This is seen as the need for believers to shed unnecessary burdens, worldly attachments, things that weigh them down spiritually, especially when times are tough.
Okay. And maybe the most striking image is when they lose sight of the sun and stars. Navigation becomes impossible. How was that interpreted?
This is a big one for the speaker. It represents the church losing its spiritual direction, its ability to navigate, because it's ignoring the heavenly message specifically revealed to Paul. Without that clear Pauline guidance, they argue, people lose their bearings, leading to uncertainty, confusion, and potentially losing the assurance of salvation. They link it to Paul's warning in Ephesians about being tossed by every wind of doctrine when you aren't grounded.
It sounds quite bleak. Does the speaker offer any hope in this interpretation?
There is a mention of a glimmer of hope. The speaker points to historical moments like the Reformation and ongoing work where they believe key Pauline truths have been recovered or re-emphasized.
Which truths specifically?
Things like Paul's unique apostleship, the pre-tribulation rapture, the clear distinction between Israel and the church, and especially justification by faith alone. They see these recovered truths as providing some orientation, some security for those who hold on to them.
But the overall picture is still one of worsening conditions, like the storm getting worse on the ship.
Yes, the analogy continues. The fierce storm, the ship leaking, battered, no sun or stars for days. The speaker parallels this with their view of the current dispensation drawing to a close, referencing Paul's warnings in 2 Timothy about perilous times and evil getting worse.
And the sailors eventually lost all hope of being saved.
Right. And the speaker uses that to illustrate the potential loss of assurance of salvation for believers who aren't grounded in Paul's specific gospel of grace. They contrast that despair with the strong confidence found in passages like Romans 8 or in Paul's letters to the Thessalonians.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, what's the absolute core message the speaker wants people to take away from this interpretation of Acts 27?
It really boils down to this. Just like listening to Paul could have saved that ship from disaster, the speaker argues that listening specifically and closely to Paul's teachings, as found in his letters, is crucial for Christians to navigate the challenges and potential deceptions of our time, this dispensation of grace.
So for you, listening, as you think about your own journey, whether it's spiritual understanding or learning in any field, really, it prompts a question, doesn't it? Are there voices you tend to prioritize?
Yeah, maybe the loudest voices or the most popular ones or the ones that feel most comfortable. Are you prioritizing those over sources that might offer more challenging but potentially more reliable guidance, like Paul's experienced warning in the story?
It leaves us with a final thought, I think. In this age of, well, information overload and so many different perspectives coming at you, how do you figure out which sources are truly trustworthy?
How do you avoid getting tossed around by every new idea or trend? Could there be parallels in other areas, science, history, philosophy, to this idea that sometimes very specific foundational knowledge is absolutely essential to handle complexity and avoid, well, those intellectual or spiritual shipwrecks?
Definitely something to think about.